Welcome to our lecture on egoism, altruism, the social contract, and political ethics. We're going to start our discussion by talking about egoism. So we're going to draw a distinction right away between two kinds of egoism. One of them is psychological egoism. This is a descriptive or factual thesis. It's an empirical thesis. It's not a philosophical notion. It's the view that all human actions, in fact, are ultimately self-interested, are selfish. This stands in distinction to ethical egoism, which is a normative view. It's value laden. So instead of just saying that human actions are in fact ultimately self-interested, we're saying that's the way that they should be. All human actions ought to be ultimately self-interested. And take note of that word ultimately. It might be that directly an action is for somebody else. So for instance, if you give someone a gift, you might say that's not an act of self-interest. That's being selfless. That's for somebody else. So directly, on the face of things, the action is for someone else. But if indirectly, the reason for giving the gift is to satisfy some, the receiving of good feelings from gift giving. If ultimately if that's what's going on, then we can still consider it ultimately self-interested. So it doesn't have to be directly selfish, as long as at the end of the day it's indirectly self-interested. That's the kind of acts we're talking about. So one question that we have is, does psychological egoism entail ethical egoism? In other words, suppose it's correct to say that humans are naturally selfish. Does that mean that we should be? So we know that in general, that sort of reasoning doesn't always work. The work from Scottish philosopher David Hume suggests otherwise. In fact, he goes so far to say that we can never logically derive ought statements from is statements. So just because something is a certain way doesn't mean that it ought to be, and Hume's position is that it never makes sense to go to the should or ought statement from the is statement. Human beings often tell lies. Doesn't mean that we should tell lies, right? Someone's about to kidnap an innocent child. Doesn't mean that they should. So I think those are some clear examples. Okay, let's continue. Someone who only does what is in their best interests. Out of all actions, what will maximize utility for me? So it might be that in general we mostly do this. Maybe we are psychologically wired to be looking out for ourselves. But there seem to be some counterexamples. Don't we sometimes ultimately act for our own children? And we're not really doing it for ourselves at all. We're doing it for our children. Or what about trained soldiers? They're not acting for themselves. They're acting out of duty for their country or for their fellow soldier or for the citizens of the nation that they come from. Or maybe there are just some people, maybe in their few and far between who are moral saints that perform actions that are supererogatory. Supererogatory is a fancy way of saying that these people perform actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. So if you think of someone like a Mother Teresa who dedicated their lives to combating poverty and putting the needs of others before their own needs over and over again. So again, just because we often try to do what will maximize utility for ourselves doesn't mean that we should. So here are some problems for psychological egoism. Isn't there at least one counterexample to the claim that all human actions are ultimately self-interested? Don't there exist genuine acts of altruism, or acts, for instance, that are solely done out of duty? Those would be good counterexamples. So I'm thinking about a scene from a film that a lot of you have seen, one of those Marvel movies, one of the Captain America movies. I think it's the first Captain America film that they made. And there's a scene where young Captain America, before he undergoes the experiment, when he is, barely a teenager and scrawny, he is in sort of a boot camp scenario, and the commanding officer throws a grenade out while they're training, and all the other soldiers, all the new soldiers in training, they all run away out of fear. But Steve Rogers, who is gonna become this Captain America character, he recognizes that this grenade is going to take all of them out unless something covers the blast, and there's nothing around, so he jumps on it to protect his fellow soldiers. How could an act like that be considered to be anything other than altruistic or selfless instead of selfish? Again, how could a soldier sacrificing himself by jumping on a grenade to save his battalion be self-interested? Now, maybe if you asked him, why did you do that? He might say he wanted to save his fellow soldiers, or that he was following his duty. So it was selfish because he performed an action that he wanted. So if we frame psychological egoism in terms of desires, there's always a desire that's satisfied. Well, what about desires that are strictly for others? What about, if you satisfy that, is that still egoistical or egotistical? If you desire to fulfill your duty, maybe in some sense that's selfish, but then it seems like we're left with at least two different kinds, if not a spectrum of desires. You have desires that seem to have no benefit to anyone else other than yourself, like a desire to steal everyone's money and then use it to buy material goods for yourself, versus a desire to like a Mother Teresa like desire, or a desire to do your duty or to help your fellow soldiers. So if you still want to call that egoism, then but so be it. But it seems to make room for some sort of altruism there. Let's continue on to the reading that we had. It was an article from the New York Times from 2010, and the headline is pure altruism possible? Who could doubt the existence of altruism? And they start with this example about a Virginia Tech professor, Liviu Librescu, might be saying that wrong, blocked the door to his classroom so his students could escape the bullets of Seung-Kyu Cho. Again, I might be saying that wrong. Who was on a rampage. So you might remember the Virginia Tech shooting that happened in the 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. He went on a shooting rampage that left 32 students and faculty members dead. And in doing so, Mr. Librescu gave his life. So psychological egoism is the view that every human action is ultimately self-interested, is ultimately selfish. Every single one. So it's a universal claim. It's a very strong claim. And even if for the most part this is true, can't we show that psychological egoism is false by pointing to examples like this one? Where, like either the Steve Rogers jumping on the grenade, or this Librescu example where you have this hero, this professor, who sacrificed his life to save his students. That seems to be altruistic. So let's see what the author of this article continues to say. The logical lure of egoism is different. The view seems impossible to disprove. No matter how altruistic a person appears to be, it's possible to conceive of her motive in egoistic terms. So we take examples that seem to be purely altruistic, like sacrificing yourself to save your students or to save the rest of your battalion by jumping on a grenade or by blocking a door in the case of Rogers or Librescu. And we could imagine that the person is acting selfishly. They want to save their fellow students. So it's really about them. And if we remove that want, they wouldn't have done it. On this way of looking at it, the guilt Mr. Autry would have suffered had he ignored the man on the tracks made risking his life worth the gamble. So this is another case in the article that you remember. The doctor who gives up a comfortable life to care for an AIDS patient in remote places does what she wants to do. So if you imagine someone giving up a life of comfort in America and going to some third world country to help people who are suffering from AIDS and HIV, they're doing it not for those patients because that's what they want to do. There's a drive inside of them. They get some sort of satisfaction from what appears to be self-sacrifice. So that line is key right there. I'm going to read it again. They get satisfaction from what only appears to be self-sacrifice. So Librescu and this doctor and Rogers, it seems like it's self-sacrifice. Jumping on the grenade seems like self-sacrifice or blocking the door. However, they might be getting satisfaction from that. Well, in the case of Librescu and Steve Rogers, that might not be the case because those people die before they can receive any satisfaction. And presumably they know they're going to die. So if you die for other people, then that seems to be a pretty good candidate for a counterexample to psychological egoism. Continuing on here, it seems altruism is simply self-interest of a subtle kind. The impossibility of disproving egoism may sound like a virtue of the theory. So it seems like no matter what, we can always find a desire rooted in these actions. But as philosophers of science know, it's really a fatal drawback. A theory that purports to tell us something about the world, as egoism does, should be falsifiable. Not false, of course, but capable of being tested and thus prove false. If every state of affairs is compatible with egoism, then egoism doesn't tell us anything distinctive about how things are. So if anything and everything confirms a theory, then the theory ultimately is true, but only trivially so. It doesn't really tell us anything interesting. So basically you're saying, no matter what happens, you're right. Well, if that's the case, then your theory is ultimately meaningless. So a lot of psychologists have moved away from this first version of psychological egoism, under which all human action is ultimately self-interested. And they'll say, okay, fine, maybe there are these rare cases of altruism, like the Steve Rogers jumping on the grenade, like Librescu blocking the door to prevent the shooter from harming their students. But for the most part, we're selfish. So we're predominantly selfish or egotistical. So the psychological egoist might move to what Gregory Kafka calls predominantly egoism. We act unselfishly only rarely, and then typically where the sacrifice is small and the gain to others is large, or where the gains to others are to friends or family, like other soldiers in our battalion or our students with whom we have these strong connections. So the first problem with psychological egoism is that there seem to be counterexamples, like Rogers or Librescu, or parents who act in ways that benefit their children. Second problem, even if we're forced to label all human actions as ultimately selfish, is it right to say that they're equally selfish? Or is there still a distinction that we can draw, even if there's one category of a human action and its selfishness? Is there still interesting, important divisions that we can make? So there's being selfish, and then there's being selfish. So if the Steve Rogers jumping on the grenade and the Librescu blocking the door is selfish, okay, if we're forced to admit that, fine, okay, that's being selfish. But then there's really being selfish, like someone who steals and embezzles money from a company, like in the Enron scandal, or if I, beat up an innocent kid and take his lunch money. That's an example of being selfish. And how can we, even if in some sense it's the seemingly selfless action of a Rogers or a Librescu is also, they're all selfish, I think we can still draw a distinction. Even if all actions are selfish, isn't there a difference between, say, participating in the Enron scandal and donating 90% of one's money to charity? Or between the soldier who jumps on the grenade to save the battalion versus someone who pushes someone onto the grenade to avoid themselves being blown up? So if psychological egoism is right, we're forced to throw all of these actions in the same category, the category of being selfish. But there still seems to be a range, even if we are forced to do that. So psychological egoism doesn't account for this distinction. All right, so we talked about psychological egoism, the view that all human actions are ultimately self-interested or selfish. And that's a descriptive psychological claim. It's an empirical one that we have to leave to psychologists to figure out if that's true. We looked at two potential problems with it. Number one, that there are counterexamples, like the acts of soldiers or mothers. And secondly, that there still seems to be a distinction, even if we admit that all these actions fall into this one category. Now we're going to move on to ethical egoism. Remember, that's a different view. That's not a psychological view or a descriptive view. This isn't a factual view. It's a philosophical view. It's the view that all human actions are should be ultimately self-interested. So we add the should or the ought. Another way to frame this is action A is morally correct if and only if A maximizes one's self-interest, as long as they're a healthy, rational person. So since this is a universal claim, one of the ways to attack it is to look for counterexamples. Isn't there at least one case? Isn't it sometimes wrong for one to maximize their self-interest? So, let's say that I make a promise to someone. Maybe it maximizes my self-interest to break that promise, right? If I keep the promise, then it makes that other person happy, maybe me happy a little bit, but if I break it, maybe there's some great benefit. So I'm really driven to break the promise. Or if you remember Rachel's Peeping Tom case, so there's someone in a tree with binoculars spying on a woman getting undressed, and they know they're not going to get caught. That maximizes that person's self-interest, but is that morally acceptable? Most people will say no. Consider this. Consider another issue, another potential problem with ethical egoism with respect to charity. So let's say you get tens of thousands of dollars, you inherit it, let's say, and you want to give some to charity, and you're deciding between giving some of this extra money that you got to famine relief in Africa, but on the other hand, you're a big opera fan. So you're thinking, maybe I will give the money to my local opera society. So what do? Do you give it to the local opera society, or do you give it for famine relief in Africa? Well, this view would say one thing, and our intuitions would say another. So again, this is how we test these ethical theories, is we see what the theory says, we see what our common sense and our moral intuition say, and we ask ourselves if these two align. If they don't align, that's potentially problematic for the view. So the view would say, what? Give it to the opera or give it to Africa? Well, you got to do what you want to do. And let's say you prefer to give it to the society, or the opera society. That would make you happier. So the theory says give it to the opera. But what does our common sense say about give it to the opera or give it to famine relief? Well, giving it to the opera, that would bring some joy to a lot of people, but no one's going to die if you don't give money to the opera society. But if you don't give money to the famine relief, people will die, and maybe innocent children. So if you got to choose between those, our common sense says the ethical thing is to give it to Africa. Seems like the right thing to do is give the aid to Africa. But an ethical egoist seems committed to giving it to the opera society. So ethical egoism has unsatisfactory views about charity. Here's another problem with ethical egoism. It might be inconsistent. It might require somebody to simultaneously do something and also not do something. That's no good. So how could that be? Well, suppose that you want to go to a Giants game and a buddy of yours also wants to go to a Giants game. And it turns out that there's only one seat left in the game. Well, who should get the seat? Well, what does ethical egoism tell us to do? Well, it says it's a subjective view. It's do whatever is best for you, essentially. Do what will maximize utility for you. So for person A, the person A says, okay, I'm an ethical egoist. I got to do what's best for me, so I get the ticket. But ethical egoism will simultaneously say, from person B's perspective, that they should get the ticket. But if person B gets the ticket, that means that person A is not going to get it. Because there's only one seat. So it's telling us simultaneously that person A should get the seat and that person A shouldn't get the seat. So we hit a contradiction. Ethical egoism would dictate the impossible conclusion that both A and B should attend the game, which they can't do because there's only one seat. Or put it a different way. If A is an ethical egoist, she would say B should take the last seat, since it's in B's best interest. But A would also claim that B should not take the last seat, because that's in A's best interest. Yeah, so it's another way to think about it. All right, we've said a lot, and we're going to transition to social contract theory. But before we do that, let's recap. What have we talked about? So if you've been following all along up until this point, wonderful. But if you feel like you've missed some of the points that have been made, and I don't blame you, this is tough stuff, then this is the slide for you. So pay attention here. What have we talked about so far? We've talked about egoism, and we've looked at two different versions of egoism. One of them is a descriptive, factual view, psychological egoism. It's telling us how the world is. Ethical egoism will tell us how the world should be, right? The way it is, the way it should be. Psychological egoism, ethical egoism. Psychological egoism, all actions are ultimately self-interested. And then you add the should, they should be that way. You get ethical egoism. Or more precisely, action A is morally correct if and only if that action A maximizes one's self-interest. So those are the two views. And then we looked at 6 problems. 2 of them for psychological egoism and 4 for ethical egoism. First problem for psychological egoism. Aren't there counterexamples to this view? Aren't there some actions that are not ultimately self-interested? For instance, the Steve Rogers person who jumps on a grenade, sacrificing themselves for the battalion. Or the Professor Libresco case in the Virginia Tech shooting. They held down the door so the students could survive, and they ultimately gave up their life. So those seem to be pretty plausible cases where the action was not ultimately self-interested. So what the psychological egoist could say, okay, fine, there are some rare counterexamples, but for the most part, actions are self-interested. Ultimately self-interested. So then we say predominant egoism. And then the next problem is, if we look at our actions, isn't there a range? Even if more or less they're all in this category of being selfish, compare someone who embezzles from innocent people, like in the Enron scandal. Yeah, somebody in that scandal would be a scoundrel. In the Enron scandal, versus someone who gives 90% of their salary to charity. So if the psychological egoist is saying that, all acts are the same, we're all selfish, then it doesn't seem like they're waking up to the difference between those sorts of actions. There's selfish actions, and then there's selfish actions. Fine, they're both selfish, but come on, there's a difference there, isn't there? So then we move on to ethical egoism. It's a view about how the world should be. It's a normative view, not just an empirical, factual, descriptive view of how the world is. It's a philosophical view. And we looked at 4 potential problems for it. The view is telling us that it's always okay to be selfish. But is that right? Aren't there at least some cases where it's wrong to be selfish? You know, like the Rachel's Peeping Tom case. That person's being selfish, but we still think that it is wrong. What about the soldier grenade case or the Librescu case? That wasn't maximizing their self-interest, and that seems like it was the right thing to do. Ethical egoism gives us a funny view on charity. Ethical egoists would say give the money to the Opera Society over famine relief, but our intuition is, no, the right thing to do is give it to famine relief because that'll help save so many lives. Yeah, giving to the opera is good, but if you have this opportunity to help others, that one's morally superior. And then finally, the problem of it being inconsistent. If we say action A is morally correct if and only if it maximizes one's self-interest, what do we do in the case when there's only one seat left, say at a Giants game, and two people want it? The theory is going to tell both of them that they get it, which is logically impossible. Okay, so that's what we've done so far. Let's move on now to something entirely different, social contract theory. So we've covered egoism, and we're going to look at something else. We're going to look at a view where morality is not objective, it's not mind independent. It is dependent upon rules that are made up by human beings. So conventions, or morality is an invention or convention. So historically, one of the major thinkers that wrote about social contract theory is Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher, born in the 16th century but predominantly lived in the 17th century, considered to be the so-called father of social contract theory. And you guys are likely reading excerpts from one of his major texts, Leviathan. And in that text, he writes about the state of nature. So this is like tens of thousands of years ago. What was it like to be a human being in sort of a hunter-gatherer living on the plains of Africa before civilization? The cavemen, more or less. He's describing life before civilization. What was it like? Well, with society and money and social status and etc., there are socioeconomic classes, and some people have more power than others, and technology and weapons. But tens of thousands of years ago, nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of the bodies and mind. So more or less, we were equal. Now there's really a spectrum of powers and abilities. So even kind of the weakest human tens of thousands of years ago, the more or less they could have a shot at killing the strongest. Maybe there's somewhat of a difference, but it's mostly negligible, says Hobbes. You could either, if you weren't as strong, you could kind of sneak up on them and drop a rock on their head or something by secret machination. Like dropping a rock on someone's head would be like a secret plot. So everyone's pretty much equal. And if there are any two men desiring the same thing, which nevertheless they couldn't both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way they endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So there's limited resources. And people are fighting over them. Everyone's out for themselves, out for self-preservation. So we have a very pessimistic view on human nature. At best, there's limited altruism, but at worst, human beings are just evil to their core. We're going to talk about a French thinker named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he has some other things to say about this, but we'll set that aside for now. So what is the world like tens of thousands of years ago? There's no civilization, there's no hospitals, there's no schools, there's no infrastructure, there's no community colleges, there's no parent-teacher association, there's no public utilities, there's no police, there's no firefighters, and we'll focus on the red there. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But then, fast forward to today, and we've established social order. We've moved away from the absolute freedom that we all once had, and we decided that we'll give up some of those individual freedoms and live in a group, live in a society, live in a civilization, because it's better for everybody. So here, Hobbes is making explicit his belief about morality. Morality for Hobbes, it's not like Plato's morality. It's not objective, right? It's not mind independent. So this is not moral realism. We might consider it cognitivism, but it's not moral objectivism or moral realism. Instead, morality is relative to social agreements, what he calls the social contract. So morality and so justice is what he's talking about here, but more or less morality is a quality that relate to men in society, not in solitude. So without society, there's no morality. So morality is socially dependent. But for Plato, the good, right and wrong does not depend on social rules. Justice is something objective. Let's skip to the second bullet point. You can read the first one on your own, but the second one, morality for the social contract theorist, is a result of human agreement over time to relinquish individual freedoms in order to form a government. So you got to compare the way things presumably used to be tens of thousands of years ago versus how they are now. In the past, more or less, we had absolute freedom. You could do whatever you want. There was no rules. There was no morality. And in some sense, that's great. We kind of love, as Americans even, we're obsessed with this notion of, pure absolute freedom. You can do whatever you want. There's something beautiful about that, right? We love that. Do whatever you want. Great. But the downside is life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So what we decided was, what's a better deal is we'll live in a world where we don't have absolute freedom. We'll limit our individual freedom. You can't shout fire in the theater. You can't go around murdering people. You can't go around stealing from people. You can't go around lying to people. But you still have lots of freedom, just like the freedoms we have in America. Maybe freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. But you can't go around murdering, stealing, and killing from people willy-nilly. And what do we get for giving up some of those freedoms? We get social order. We get police. We get fire. We get the arts. We get education. We get infrastructure. And so it's a better deal for everyone. And that's what is really the impetus, the driving force behind the creation of morality. It's something we created to benefit, something we created for everyone's benefit. So we're going to talk about something called the prisoner's dilemma, which ultimately is going to be evidence for moving away from absolute freedom toward the social contract. So if I haven't sold you already, then our discussion of this thing called the prisoner's dilemma should nudge you in that direction. So here's the prisoner's dilemma. We got two people. Let's say we've got you and we got somebody else. Call him Steve. And the police have rounded you and Steve up, and they've got you on drug trafficking charges. And you know you're innocent. And you also know that Steve's innocent. But the police have got you in a tough spot. Because the police, they're not going home until they bust at least one of you guys. And they're trying to get you to testify against Steve, even though you know Steve's innocent and so are you. But they want you to say, oh yeah, it was Steve. He's the drug trafficker. And you know they're going to ask Steve to get the dirt on you, to testify against you. So the police ask you, okay, here's a paper, sign it, saying that Steve is involved in the drug trafficking. And you can either sign it, you can testify against Steve, or you can stay quiet, say, no, I'm not going to do it. So those are your options. And Steve gets the same one. He can either testify against you, or he can stay quiet. So we've got 4 potential way things are going to go. Either you both testify against each other, or you both stay quiet, or one testifies and the other stays quiet, and vice versa. If you both testify against each other, if you say Steve did it and Steve says you did it, then you both are going to get 5 years in prison. Because the police, they kind of got something on one of you. If you both stay quiet, you might say, hey, we're both in... oh, by the way, you're not allowed to communicate with Steve. You can't make a deal with Steve. So this represents a state of nature where there's no communication, there's no deals, there's no agreement. In the state of nature, there's no agreement. Everyone fends for themselves. And maybe you haven't even met Steve. You don't even know who the heck Steve is. But you know he's innocent, so maybe you both stay quiet. Oh, you also don't get to base what you're going to do based on what Steve does. So you have to make a decision going into this in the dark, and you don't know you can't talk to Steve beforehand, and you don't know what Steve's going to do. So maybe you're like, hopefully he'll stay quiet. So maybe you stay quiet, and he ends up staying quiet too. You both get 1 year in prison if that happens. The only way that you can walk away free is if you testify against Steve and he stays quiet. You would go free. But then Steve, he's going to face the brunt. He's going to get 10 years in prison. But man, if you stay quiet and you do the so-called honorable thing, you don't testify against Steve, you know he's innocent, but he testifies against you, then Steve will walk and you get 10 years in prison. Now suppose all you want to do is avoid jail time. Suppose that's your only motivation. You want to minimize jail time. Then what's the best thing to do? Do you testify or do you stay quiet? So think about that. We can kind of figure this out almost mathematically. If you're don't worry about, your sense of morality, set that aside for a moment. But if your only goal is to minimize prison time, what should you do? Well, it turns out philosophers have figured this out. And if your only goal is to minimize jail time, prison time, and you can't communicate or make an agreement with Steve, then it's clear what you should do. You should testify no matter what. Why is that? Well, if you testify, you're going to get the better deal no matter what Steve does. If you testify and Steve testifies, you get 5 years. But if you testify and Steve stays quiet, then you get a walk, right? So, regardless, testifying is going to minimize your amount of jail time. If you Yeah, so regardless of what's going to happen, testifying is better than staying quiet. Maybe that's a more helpful way to think about it. Right? So if Steve testifies, then you can testify or stay quiet. But testifying will get you the better deal, right? If Steve testifies and you testify, you get 5 years. But if Steve testifies, you stay quiet, you get 10 years. So in that case, you want to testify, right? If Steve testifies, then the way to minimize jail time is if you testify. And similarly, if Steve stays quiet, then testifying in your case will get the better deal, right? Compare Steve staying quiet to you testifying versus staying quiet. If you testify, you go free. And that's better than 1 year in prison, which you get if you don't testify. Yeah, so notice a peculiar conclusion that human beings being self-interested in a state of nature like world where you can't make agreements, it really screws everybody because you're really just out for self-preservation in a state of nature. So you're gonna, and that manifests, in the as trying to minimize jail time, trying to self-preserve your life. And Steve's going to do the same thing. So if you're both egoists and you're both in the state of nature and you can't make agreements, then what are you both going to do? You're both going to testify and you both end up getting 5 years. So this supports our transition away from the absolute freedom of the state of nature. It really supports the idea that social morality, or these agreements, the social contract's the way to go. Because once we allow agreement, then you and Steve can talk and be like, look, if we just are selfish here, we're going to screw ourselves. We're both going to testify. We're both going to get 5 years. But if we make an agreement, then we'll both stay quiet. It sucks. We'll both get a year. But overall, that's the best. Because otherwise, we're getting 5 years or 10 years. So if we can make an agreement, that's the way to go. But in the original Prisoner's Dilemma, you're not allowed to make an agreement because it's supposed to mirror the state of nature. So this supports the Prisoner's Dilemma. Has lots of implications and lots of it's evidence for lots of things. But what I want you to remember is that it supports the movement away from the state of nature toward agreements about morality, toward the social contract. The Prisoner's Dilemma supports social contract theory. Okay, let's talk about this French thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here's a painting of Rousseau, or an image of a painting. 18th century French thinker, and he literally wrote the book on the social contract called, drumroll, The Social Contract. How does Rousseau describe the transition from the state of nature to society in the social contract? The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man. By substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and giving his actions the morality they had formerly lacked. So in the state of nature, we're stuck on instinct, we're selfish, life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And when we go to the social contract, we get justice. Then only, when we have the social contract, we have the voice of duty. Before that, we don't have duty. It's just selfishness. We just have physical impulses, the right of appetite. Although in this state, he deprives himself of some advantages which he got from nature. So if you go with society, you do give up some freedoms, but the gains are worth it. You get your faculties are stimulated, right? Your ideas extended, his feelings ennobled, his soul uplifted. So, and we're skipping down, instead of a stupid and unimaginative animal, society makes him an intelligent being and man. So in the state of nature, we're unimaginative, stupid, almost beast animals. And we want to go with civilization because we get we got to be civilized. So you can see some of this 18th century European thinking seeping into the language there. We talked about problems for psychological and ethical egoism. Now, what about problems for social contract theory? Well, historically, there have been lots of social contracts that don't seem to be ethical. So, if you ask these thinkers, what are ethics? They'll say, whatever the social agreement is, whatever the social contract says. But if that's right, then the theory says that any and all social contracts are moral, but that flies in the face of our moral intuitions. There's a misalignment there. What about social contracts where there was an exploitation of a group of people, like apartheid in South Africa, the slave trade, segregation in the South, or bans on gay marriage? It seems these people have transferred their freedoms to the government without reaping the benefits. So the reply from the social contract theorist is, fine, let's not say that morality is based in actual historical social contracts. Instead, let's say that we're working toward an ideal social contract. We're not quite there yet. So you can see there at the bottom, perhaps morality doesn't originate from the actual contract, but an ideal one. And in the ideal contract, if you believe in marriage equality, then that would be protected. Same thing with apartheid and the slave trade. Is those are a part of historical actual contracts, but wouldn't be part of an ideal social contract. Then the problem is, what would the ideal social contract say? So we have an epistemological problem, right? So we've solved one problem, but we might have created another. Let's talk about John Rawls. John Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice, where the theme there is justice is about fairness. Justice is fairness. He's an American thinker, mostly from the 20th century. Talking about ideal contracts, John Rawls has a solution. How are we supposed to know what the contract's going to say? Well, here's how we'll figure that out. We will imagine what clear thinking, rational, what we'll say those self-interested people, what they would agree upon. So the ideal system of government would be one set up by a group of self-interested people, but they know nothing about themselves. So they're behind what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance. They're in what Rawls calls the original position. So they don't know their gender, their socioeconomic status, their political affiliation, their race, their ethnicity, their cultural, their sex, their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs. They don't know any of that stuff. And let's say these people, they're going to make the rules about morality, the rules about government, the agreement, the social contract. What are the rules that they would make up? So that's the ideal contract. That is the basis for morality. And Rawls believes that we can figure out more or less what they're going to say. Okay, again, let's review. We did a review of egoism, and now let's do a review of social contract theory. Well, we got the two major thinkers, Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes, the English thinker who wrote Leviathan, and Rousseau, the French thinker, 18th century, who wrote The Social Contract. There's no objective morality for these thinkers. Morality is an invention. The basis of morality is the social contract. Why should we transition away from the state of nature? Why should we avoid it to get the social contract? Well, in the state of nature, we have absolute freedom, but life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And it's like the prisoner's dilemma. We don't get to make agreements, so we end up kind of screwing ourselves. But with the social contract, we get medicine, infrastructure, education, technology, culture, security, police, firefighters, military. And and people aren't going to go around killing, lying, and stealing. There's checks and balances. So it's a form of it's a rejection of moral realism. It's not objectivism. But we can still have moral statements that are truth apt, so we can have cognitivism, but it's going to be relative. But instead of being relative to a culture or an individual, it's relative to a contract, either a historical one. The problems there is that historical contracts are seemingly immoral, like contracts that allow apartheid, slave trade, segregation in the South. But then we say, let's make it about an ideal contract, like what Rawls had in mind. And that would be the contract that people who are unbiased would come up. They're unbiased because they don't know about anything about themselves, but they're going to come up with these rules. They're in the original position behind the veil of ignorance. They're the lawmakers, and whatever they say goes. And presumably, they wouldn't allow apartheid or slave trade, or they would allow equal rights, because it's not going to be rules set up by people who are influenced by lobbyists and influenced by their upbringing and privilege, etc. It'll be a completely fair set of morals. There's a little bit still of an epistemological problem that it's not exactly clear what these people would say. And then it says a second problem there. What about those who can't agree to the contract? So children or people who have lost their rationality. Well, what we can say is just this, how we deal with people like that now. We have people related to them, usually family members or close friends, or at the very least, some kind of power of attorney person, that they are the stewards or the caretakers looking out for their interests. Yeah. Again, the agreement to the contract, if there's not an actual contract, I mean, I guess there could be in some versions of it, but for most, it's sort of an invisible contract. It's an unspoken contract that we don't explicitly sign. We tacitly agree to it just by participating in society. And theoretically, if you don't like it, you could go and live in the state of nature. Go move just a remote part of a jungle, and you can have your absolute freedom back. But as we know, people don't do that because life there would be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Thank you, Hobbes, and thank you for listening to our lecture this time around. I will see you on the other side.